good morning, everyone. So I guess that now it's 11 o'clock in Hong Kong, but it's in evening in California. But welcome, Professor Roberts. So we need to get it started. So first, I will briefly introduce the speakers of today. I believe that I don't need to speak too much because actually we are so, I believe most of us at least are so familiar with Professor Roberts' work. And also her tools, the structural topic modeling, the R package for that is still one of the most popular tool in computational social science. I guess the most the participants here that actually use that one and are still using it. So
Hey,
a
that's
few
great.
words about it. Yeah, Professor Roberts is um, she received her PhD from Harvard in government in 2014 and a master degree in statistics from Stanford in 2009. And currently is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of California, San Diego. She co-directs the China Data Lab at the 21st Century China Center and is also an affiliate at the Institute for Global Conflict and Cooperation. Her research interests lie in the intersection of political methodology and digital politics. So, without further ado, so let's welcome Professor
Yeah.
Roberts. We are very happy that we can invite you to be here. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes,
Hi,
actually,
everyone.
yeah.
Thanks so much for having me. Today I'm going to talk about the impact of regulation on open source development and look at evidence from Gitee. This is a new paper. We don't actually have a paper, at least online yet. And so I'm really hoping to get your feedback and your thoughts about the paper. And it's joint with Patrick Chester, who's a postdoc at China Data Lab, and Ray Jia, who's an economist in the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. Um, yeah. The kind of motivation of this paper is to look at open source development and how politics is influencing open source development. So open source has really become a hub of innovation in the tech world. We have huge projects like Linux, TensorFlow, OpenCV, huge projects that are inputs to code used in um, so many applications worldwide. Um, okay, open source, so like lots and lots of software relies on source code contributed to by developers all over the world, R, Python, Linux, Android, etc. And software developers, data analysts, academics are increasingly reliant on these tools. And in fact, kind of a lot of things that are used every day, like the cars we drive, the computers we run, right, the cell phones we use, a lot of those also have open source components as well. So these are part of kind of what we think of as the software value chain, part of the software value chain. GitHub is the platform that hosts most of this open source code. So this is the largest source code hub in the world. There's something like 28 million open repositories on GitHub and many more private repositories. So GitHub is not only a platform where you can share code publicly, it's also a platform where you can collaborate more privately on projects, right? But these are 28 million open repositories where they're kind of being shared publicly. And GitHub is also, a platform that has contributions from users worldwide. And it's interesting because there's a lot of economics literature about why open source works. Why do people put all this work in to share their code, right? And there are all these economic theories about how open source creates a hub of innovation by matching software developers with companies who might be recruiting. So having open code allows recruiters to see how you develop code to work with you before recruiting you, right? But also open source can nudge innovation in particular ways. So companies will open source their code so that people will develop using that code, and then that helps the company in a particular way, right? So there's, even though it seems sort of counterintuitive that open source would be such a hub of innovation, there's a lot of interesting economics research that analyzes to try to understand why it's become so big and so important to our software workflows. However, open source is also not free from politics, and there have been many efforts uh, or regulations that touch open source, that impacting open source. So I think, maybe in the late 1990s, early 2000s, you have kind of an unregulated internet. But more recently, we've seen these sort of countries try to impose their regulations online, and that has impacted open source as well. So in the United States, international sanctions, the Linux Foundation just posted a warning recently that open source developers really need to pay attention to US government sanctions and not, know who they're collaborating with on certain projects so they're not inadvertently violating sanctions. The US government has also become more and more concerned about cybersecurity and open source, where potentially bad actors could insert bugs into open source code that could undermine, critical infrastructure, other types of software. And so there have been several bills that have been being sort of drafted in Congress to try to address this. But also we see this in other areas as well. So recently the EU tried to has put forward some AI regulation, and this also creates some complexities for open source. So the EU AI Act has some ways in which they try to carve out exceptions for open source, but there's some sort of ways in which if like an open source project was then privatized or used for commercial reasons, then it might actually come under the EU AI Act. So there are ways in which these types of regulations on AI, on international sanctions, et cetera, start touching open source. And then, of course, China has had a longer sort of conflict with open source, if you want to say, that because it conflicts also with its wanting to domestically control the flow of information. So in 2013, China blocked GitHub because there was political content it didn't like on GitHub, but it was unblocked a few days later, which I'll explain in a minute. And so the sort of censorship apparatus in China has been worried about GitHub as one of sort of the few unblocked foreign platforms that where information can spread on GitHub that's not just code, but it's also political, right? In 2020, for example, GitHub was used for spreading stories that people were writing about COVID-19 that were being censored in domestic platforms, and this was viewed as problematic from like a domestic control of information perspective. But the issue in any of these cases, really, with regulating open source is that open source is also central to innovation, to technological development, to all of these things, right? And so, for example, when China blocked GitHub in 2013, Kai-Fu Lee posted on Weibo, this is an English translation, blocking GitHub is unjustifiable and will only derail the nation's programmers from the world, the nation being China's programmers from the world, while bringing about a loss in competitiveness and insight. So while these countries, the EU, the US, and China would like in some cases to regulate open source, it's also would have a huge disadvantage. Too much regulation creates a disadvantage for open source programmers, which then could push them away from other programmers in the world who are critical to that kind of innovation, and also make them less competitive, right? So there's this trade-off between regulation and innovation that I think we're seeing over and over in the digital context, the digital politics context. So the trade-off between innovation and regulation here is that platforms users benefit from free, unregulated environments, right? If for open source developers, they want the largest pool of potential contributors, the more people you can persuade to work on your project, the better your project is going to be, right? So the bigger the pool for of people who could contribute to your project, the better. The bigger the platform, the better, right? They also want the largest audience of users. So if they can have the biggest audience of users, that's also what they want. So any type of sort of regulation or constriction of these environments can create frictions that make users leave. Then that it puts these platforms users, it decreases the benefit of a platform, right? So this free flow of information can often conflict with these countries' regulatory sensibilities. So we sort of think about these trade-offs between innovation and regulation to hypothesize that moves toward regulation will alienate users from platforms that are that regulation applies to. So the more that a regulation applies to a platform, the more that users will tend to leave that platform and move to other sort of more open environments where they can attract more contributors or a bigger audience, right? And these small sort of frictions on use can become very frustrating to developers and make them leave to go somewhere else. We also think that more open platforms, the ones that are less regulated, will tend to attract users from regulated platforms. So if one platform comes under regulation, other platforms that are more open will start to attract those users. So the case study that we look at for this, for trying to understand how regulation of open source is regulation of Gitee, which is a China-based privately owned code sharing platform that's modeled after GitHub. So Gitee is kind of a different version of open source code sharing, similar to GitHub, but with some differences. And it's China-based. It's much smaller than GitHub, so it has 8 million developers compared to GitHub's 100 million. And even though it was originally just developed as a private company, it was supported by the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, I think in like 2019 or 2020, as a means of limiting dependence on GitHub. So it became sort of an effort by China to nationalize open source by attracting developers to a national code sharing platform that was easier to control than GitHub. So there's became a sort of an alternative, a strategic alternative to GitHub, which was becoming difficult to regulate, right? So Gitee was emerging as sort of a different model or a different company for open source sharing in China. But then that also allows it to be internally regulated by the government, right? So on May 18th of 2022, all repositories were made private on Gitee pending a review. So there was this date where after this date, or on this date, if you had a public repository on Gitee, it was suddenly made private. So nobody else, it was not public anymore. Nobody could see it. And everything needed to be reviewed before anything became public. So imagine if you're a coder that you might think that like everything breaks, right? Things aren't public anymore. Everything breaks. So then, and then after this date, if you wanted to create a new repository, you needed moderated approval to be posted. And some of those repositories that were reviewed on May 18th of 2022 were made private. And the phrasing of Gitee's announcement implies that this moderation was really forced on them. So it wasn't something that they decided to do. It was something that was coming from, central direction, right? And interestingly, so we have this sort of national alternative, but because it's domestic to China, then it can be subject to more regulation, right? So interestingly, around the same time period that this censorship event occurs on Gitee, we also have this sudden sort of throttling of access to GitHub that occurs around the same time period. So this is data from UNI, which looks at access to different websites from around the world, and then also greatfire.org. And what we see is that the successful connection rate, there are slightly different measures of access for a website, but the successful connection rate of GitHub from China takes a pretty deep dive at the beginning of 2021 in both cases. And then according to Greatfire, takes another dive in starting right around this time period that Gitee is also coming under increased regulation. So over this time of 2019 through 2024, we go from a pretty unfiltered access to GitHub to fairly throttled use of GitHub during this time period. So as Gitee is becoming regulated, there's also this increasing sort of block happening of GitHub as well. So the research questions that we try to ask in this paper are, from the censorship perspective, first of all, we can tell which repositories have been removed. So we want to know what things led repositories to be targeted for removal. And then we also ask, did censorship of Gitee lead to the exit of users? So did people, this event on Gitee in mid-May 2022 lead people to leave Gitee? And if so, what types of users were most affected? So which ones were more likely to leave? And then also, did this push users on Gitee to other alternative platforms? In particular, we're interested in GitHub because we know that GitHub is being more throttled during this time period, but still, with what's happening on Gitee, do people leave and go to GitHub? And last, we ask, did limiting access to GitHub through throttling reduce the commits from users in mainland China? So we do this huge amount of data collection on both Gitee and GitHub to try to understand this. So for Gitee, we do a snowball sample because it's difficult to randomly sample users with the API. So we take a seed, we find Gitee references to Gitee repositories on GitHub as a seed. And then we do 3 rounds of snowball sampling using Gitee's API, where we can say, okay, who contributed to repositories that these users used? Okay, let's go and find their contributors. Let's find their contributors, etc. So we do 3 rounds of snowball sampling on Gitee's API. And so we end up with data on about 23,000 users, 430,000 repositories, and a whole bunch, and about 4 million commits. And this includes both users and organizations. So we also we look at the organizations that these users most contributed to, and then we collect the commits of for all of their projects. So we look if they get fewer commits after this private repository, like is their user base diminishing, and then does that affect like how productive they can be in a sense. We also take a subset of Gitee users, so we have a lot of Gitee users data, and then we try to find if they link to GitHub accounts. We try to find corresponding GitHub accounts that are linked to Gitee users. So we have this data set of cross-platform users, people who use both Gitee and GitHub. Do we see them switching their activity more to GitHub or to Gitee? And we're also able to, we have this, there's like a repository on Gitee that has where people are able to raise issues. It's sort of like a help forum for Gitee. So we can scrape that 12,000 issues raised by Gitee users, and we can and we look at things like what people on Gitee are complaining about. So are they complaining about the private this event that happens in May of 2022. On GitHub, we collect sort of a similar data set. Obviously, we have to collect it in a different way because the API works differently, but we try to collect at least like a data set that we can look at over time. And so we collect GitHub users who mentioned China locations in their profile. We collect, a whole bunch of users, 385,000 users, 8 million repositories, 13 million commits. And we use Google BigQuery to do this, which is how easiest way to interact with the GitHub API. And then we also gathered data from both UNI and greatfire.org on data on connection attempts from China to github.com. I already showed you that earlier. So we know exactly which days where we think that GitHub was more and less throttled. So what we're able to do, so for all of our accounts, we only collect users that appear before the censorship date. So we don't want, and then we see how their commits are influenced by the censorship event. So that's both for GitHub and for Gitee. In doing that, we're also able to find, just straight from the GitHub or Gitee API, we can see repositories that used to exist but were blocked on that date, and we can actually verify that they were blocked on the date on that May date. So we can actually see which types of repositories went missing on that day. Only very few, we may be missing some of those repositories if an entire user account got blocked, but of the data that we have, we think very, very few repositories were actually blocked. Like all the repositories were made private and then went back on, but then we think that 99.8% of them went back online. So actually very, very few repositories, according to our data, were actually taken offline. The repositories that were taken offline were mostly rather repositories related to gaming, related to VPNs. So we have actually quite a few things about VPNs, and then also gaming repositories. These are sort of the words that were most predictive, terms that were used in the repository that were most predictive of them being taken off. I think for the most part, a lot of them seemed like they were VPN repositories or related to gaming, but very, very few repositories overall. So despite this, we see huge declines on Gitee in use of Gitee for our users. So this is the log of commits for our sample. And what we see here is sort of a peak right before the date where all these repositories were made private, and then just like a huge decline in the number and the amount of activity on Gitee. So at first we were a little bit worried that maybe this was just a driven by cohorts, that like maybe a lot of people joined Gitee at a certain time here, like maybe right here, a whole bunch of people joined Gitee, and this was just kind of the natural time when they start declining. But we actually looked at this even by cohort. So each of these colored lines are a different cohort depending on account creation year, if accounts were created in 2012, 2014, 2016, 2018. And for each of these cohorts, we see a decline in use right at that moment, that May moment when all these repositories were made private. So we definitely see this like decline in Gitee activity that we think is related to this event. And even the repositories that started in 2022, they're sort of naturally increasing like any new repository would do, but then they have this sudden decline that seems to be coming from the censorship event. The ones that started in 2020 also declined right at that moment. We also see this for organizations. So this is just for users, but we also see for organizations that they have fewer commits to their projects, and those fewer, like this declining amount of commits to their projects. And that also starts right at around the censorship date. So um, these are the users again, and we split them in this first row into users that have greater than the 90th percentile of commits and users who have less than the 90th percentile of commits. And we do see that users who are like less active are more affected by the event, which is sort of what we would expect, that users who have sort of more invested in a platform are more likely to stay on the platform, whereas users who are less invested be more likely to leave. We definitely see that here with the Git the users. And these are organizations, the number of commits that they have on their repositories, and we see on the biggest organizations are the least affected, and the smallest organizations are the most affected. So we definitely see that pretty robustly across users and organizations. Then we looked at those cross-platform users, so those users who were on both Gitee and GitHub. And we actually see a decline in use of both Gitee and GitHub for these users, but the Gitee decline is steeper than the GitHub decline. So if you do like a diff and diff of this, you see that Gitee is sort of more affected, although it's hard to really tell if like the parallel trends holds in this case, because we also see the decline is happening earlier as well. So we're trying to figure out, like, from, these cross-platform users, they do decline both on GitHub and on Gitee, probably because they're sort of both affected by this event. So how do Gitee users respond? So what's interesting is if we look at this issue repository where there was like a whole, like this is kind of like the help, one of the help places you can get help on Gitee, we see this huge increase in Gitee complaints, right? Like about 6 months, say, before the event. And I think this is in part because we see an increase in use of Gitee about 6 months before the event. But also there are also a lot of complaints early on here about real name registration that happens a little bit earlier in this time period. And then of course the event itself, which happens right around here. When we go in and read some of these complaints, we can tell that Gitee users were very aware of this event. We definitely get some examples of people saying, as paying users, the platform has single-sidedly changed the rules without prior notice. The repository cannot be set to public. Why have all my public repositories suddenly turned into private repositories? Private repositories images are not showing up. We get all of these complaints on this day about this event. So we definitely know that people noticed. It wasn't just something that kind of happened very quickly and then went unnoticed. Then we asked, did users move to GitHub? And actually, we don't really see that at all. So we use the same method to collect a GitHub sample from other locations that are not China. So mostly this is in the US. And as a comparison, so this is the blue group. And then the China group that I mentioned earlier is the red group. And for the most part, these are both just pretty flat. Like we don't see a bunch of activity that's changing commits in China versus in other. And so this is not what we expected. We expected there to be a huge increase in GitHub use with this decline in Gitee use. But we don't see that at all, basically. And we also, even in the cross-platform users, if I'll go back to that really fast, we don't see this increase in GitHub use. We see this sort of decline in GitHub use, actually among the cross-platform users. So I think that has been perplexing us for a very long time, except that then when we look at throttling on GitHub, we see that the days that we collect data where they're more heavily throttled also tend to be the days where there are fewer commits. So this is the proportion of bad connections by the day level using that UNI and Great Fire data. And then we look at commits, and we definitely see that there's a relationship where on days where there are worse connections, there are fewer commits. On days when there are better connections, there are more commits. So we think that maybe this lack of increase in use of GitHub is coming from the throttling. We can also look at this with sort of just like an interactive diff and diff model where these are GitHub commits for cross-platform users. And we see, just like we saw in that plot, that the censorship event, that May 18th event, decreased GitHub commits, which is not what we expected, but probably it's because of the throttling. But that does go up a little bit on days that are okay, where the GitHub connection is okay. And that effect of it being of that connection being on for GitHub is larger after the censorship event than before the censorship event, although it doesn't get us back to the pre-censorship event GitHub commits. So we do think that there's something about the throttling that is making GitHub not be a substitute for Gitee after the event itself. Okay, so those are my main findings. And just to summarize, censorship is associated with this sort of dramatic decline in Gitee activity. And it appears across accounts of different ages, accounts of different sizes, although certainly the larger accounts are less affected than the smaller, or the more frequent committers are more affected than the less frequent committers, and the larger organizations are less affected than the smaller organizations. The repositories that seem to have been targeted for removal were the ones that offered VPNs to circumvent the Great Firewall, or also these gaming related repositories. And these large organizations, again, as I said, appear to be less affected. This spike in complaints on Gitee corresponds to the censorship event, but there's really little evidence that Gitee users move to other platforms such as GitHub. We don't see that at all. On throttling, we definitely see a relationship between GitHub activity and the amount of throttling that's happening on that particular day among cross-platform users. So users who we think are both on Gitee and on GitHub, and we think those users are likely to be in mainland China, but it's obviously hard to know. So some implications and open questions. I think what this shows is that these types of regulations can really have huge impacts on the user base, and people are sort of maybe have very high elasticities when it comes to switching between platforms. And efforts to sort of nationalize open source may ultimately fail if nationalizing open source also is, comes along with this increased amount of regulation. The other thing that I think is interesting is that these censorship events, the national censorship events on a China-based platform, also coincides with international censorship, so more throttling of GitHub. So if you're going to regulate Gitee, then in order for people not to just move to GitHub, which is not the goal of the policy, you have to throttle GitHub more. We also see this in other examples where there's sort of, as you do more internal domestic regulation, you have to do more external international regulation in order to make it so people don't substitute, right? So I think that's certainly a pattern that we're seeing here. Some open questions that we're still puzzling over is, where did these users go if not GitHub? We've looked into other platforms that users may have gone to. we just can't really figure this out. I think there's just from sort of talking to people who've used GitHub and Gitee, or my sense is that people are often going to private platforms owned by companies that they work for to do open source collaboration. So or not open source collaboration, to collaborate on code. And so they're actually exiting, in my sense, the open source development um, and focusing more on private development of code. I think that's what seems to be happening. And if that is the case, then what are the implications for open source recruitment of users? I think it's an interesting question. If people are exiting open source, how does that affect recruitment for companies that are relying on open source? How does that affect sort of the software development ecosystem in China and more broadly globally? And so I think those are interesting questions as well. Um, yeah, and I think there's also some really interesting questions to think about as companies in China, make their code open source, which is, on GitHub, on Hugging Face, on other blocked platforms. How do we think about that the development of open source more generally in software in China? So thanks to the Sloan Foundation and 21st Century China Center for their support, and interested to hear your um, comments and questions and reactions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. That is very, very
Mm.
interesting study, and actually I have a lot of thoughts here, but
Yeah.
I think that we need to open this for to the audience first. So if you any in the audience that you have a question, so you can just post in the chat box. Also, you can raise your hand. It's so quiet as you. As always, so okay. So probably I will start from Haixin. Haixin, do you want to ask the question directly?
Oh, no, I think, okay, yeah, do you want me to repeat it or Haishin, do you want to ask it?
Yeah, thank you for the sharing. I just have some random thoughts regarding the final open question. That is, maybe the Gitee users are those with less access to GitHub, so they are
Yeah.
not likely to migrate to GitHub as what you hypothesized before testing the data.
That's a really great
Yeah, just
thought.
some
I
my
think you're
random
right.
thoughts regarding
Yeah,
the finding.
yeah.
Yeah. I was also thinking about this. Why why could this happen? So just sharing my thoughts regarding this.
Yeah, like maybe yeah.
have a related hypothesis. That is, we need to rethink about the how that we created the Gitee. So
Yeah.
you think about that as from like usually that is from a political campaign. So we need to nationalize the platform. So think about that the users on Gitee that probably actually the
Mhm.
users are created. They are not natural users. So what
Oh,
I mean
that's
created is
interesting.
probably you think about that probably they already have a account on GitHub, but using different names, or probably they have no need to use the GitHub, but actually they have some responsibilities or pressures from the upper level. They need to create
Mhm.
some accounts there. So even the platform totally gone. They have no motivation to create the alternatives on GitHub or any other platforms. Or otherwise, probably they already have some other alternative accounts on GitHub. So that's probably why you cannot observe any migration, real migration from,
That's
yeah.
Yeah, I think you guys are right. I mean, I think what we have noticed on Giddy is there's sort of a lot of um firms firms on Giddy that are also national champions in some sense, or sort of nationally backed. And so maybe there are pressures, right, to use Giddy. Yeah, it's an interesting thought. It's hard to know, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lucy, yeah.
Yeah, may I ask a question? Thank you for presenting this fantastic
From
work.
National University of Singapore. Yeah.
Yeah,
Great,
hi,
great.
from
Nice to
my
meet you.
so
Everywhere.
yeah, you did the webinar so well, so we attend every seminar. So yeah,
That's
my
awesome.
question would be more technical than the previous one, but I do think their answers are great. So I'm also doing a research on censorship of the censorship on GitHub. So one problem I encounter is about how can I get a very robust data of censorship, because you also use one data source about the Greenfire organization, and
Yeah.
we have a lot of missing data from the website. So I'm just wondering, how did you address this issue, the missing data of censorship? Because I'm also doing some parallel trend as a DID or something like this. So
Yeah.
I think it's a very a serious issue in doing such an analysis. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you for
Yeah, no,
yeah.
it's a big problem. So we definitely run into that problem, and it's not full coverage, right, of the dates. And what's interesting is you might think, I think the other problem with it is you might think that people go to Grapevine to query it when it's down. So it's not like a random sample, right? So I think I think, have you looked at using Uni? Because that data is also publicly available and it's a good supplement, but they don't match up entirely. But that also has data on throttling of Gitee that might be, or GitHub that might be useful to you. Yeah. But you're right, it's not perfect. And
Thank you
that's
so
why we
much.
don't have
Yeah.
very many data points, actually.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. Mhm.
Anyway, I can read the question.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Xiao Yin,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah. I can't open the camera. Sorry.
No worries.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, do you have a close look at what kinds of organizations reduce their activities after the censorship? I'm thinking maybe there are the NGOs or some activists or other organizations who might be sensitive to censorship. And so I just some random look. Just some random thoughts. I'm thinking maybe a close look at some accounts who get affected or not may help to understand the mechanism of those questions you raise. Yeah, thank you.
Oh yeah, that's a really good idea. We've tried to look at this. So mostly, I think GitHub might be the place where there is more of this, but at the moment we're not looking at which repositories are more affected by the throttling on GitHub. I think on Gitee, what's interesting is that most of the users of Gitee, we were very surprised that there were VPNs that were available on Gitee, but besides that, most of we find very little politics on Gitee. It's just mostly code development, which is not true on GitHub. And so I think what might be interesting to look into on Gitee was, we've been having a little trouble with this because our thought was similar to yours, that we would see sort of this decline in use of it for politics, but we see sort of so little of that in the first place that it seems kind of strange that they would have this big censorship event, for something that is already so sort of seems so controlled. So I think maybe we could look for things like video games or gaming, those kinds of things, because that seems to be kind of a new area of control that maybe users wouldn't have anticipated. But I think we could do more of that generally. I think that's a really good thought. Yeah. And certainly we could also maybe do it on GitHub. And that'd be interesting as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for your comment. That's good.
Yes. Any other questions? So we are waiting for the next question, I'm going to ask my question first.
Great, great.
Yeah, it's very interesting when actually from the title, because actually you mentioned that is influence from the regulation on the platform that will influence some kind
Yeah.
of activities, like especially about the migration from one platform, potentially from one platform to another platform. Actually, this reminds me, currently actually there are some related events like the migration from Twitter to other platforms,
Yes,
and
yes.
also from the TikTok to Xiaohongshu. So there are different,
Right, yeah.
yeah. So this is you think about that, actually there could be more generalized I think the
Mhm.
argument. So indeed, actually, for the both events like TikTok and from to Xiaohongshu or from Twitter to other platforms, actually both because of the regulation, even like for Twitter. So this is not a regulation from the government, but it's kind of regulation, right? So
Yeah.
what I'm thinking about is what's the mechanism? So in addition to the censorship, so because
Mhm.
actually from
Yeah.
TikTok and Twitter, so obviously there's no, at least the conventional censorship, and there is no such thing on those platforms. But we can still find that actually the migration from the one platform to another. So it must be some alternative mechanisms. So I think that one is
Mm.
about a simple one. I can imagine that is a usability. So like
Mhm.
on Twitter, so that because the people do not like the way that Elon Musk that regulate the platform. The similar like
Mhm.
okay, like the Gitee. So probably it's not because of the censorship. They just because actually they make everything private, so that influence the normal
Yeah.
use, which means that the decrease the usability, the user experience. So they try to migrate to another platform to seek alternatives. So think about that,
Mhm.
even for TikTok, they're probably they're just afraid that they cannot use it. So it's kind of usability again. So they want to, so and also it explains why they don't want to switch it to another US based platform. They probably think that they cannot have a similar user experience on those US based platforms, so they turn to 小红书.
Mhm.
Yeah, so just myself. Yeah.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think that the people on Gitee were thinking this is censorship. We must leave. I think
Yeah.
it's more like uh we can't trust this platform to not break our code. And so we must leave, right? And I think that's like I think that's usability. I think that's a really good point. We could like build more around that. And I think it is interesting. I mean, we see this so many times, right? Over platforms change their policies, users leave because it doesn't, maybe because of usability, or in some cases because of like I feel like the TikTok to Xiaohongshu is
Mm.
um it was a form of political protest because I mean the choice of going to Little Red Note, a China-based app, right? That is so symbolic, right?
Yeah,
Of
true.
like why we're gonna do something that you like even worse if you block TikTok, right? And I think but blocking TikTok is a form of regulation, right? Of government regulation. They're
Mhm.
worried about the national
Mhm.
security implications. So I think it's a similar thing, except for maybe a little bit more political protest there. And definitely, Twitter, I think there's been a few migrations off of Twitter. One after um, Donald Trump's account was banned, conservatives left Twitter
Yeah.
in large scale. And maybe you could argue that's in part because of usability of moderation that they didn't agree with. And then after Elon Musk bought Twitter, we see a whole bunch of more liberals migrate to Blue Sky, right? And they complain also about usability, that the algorithm is giving them things they don't want, right? So I feel like totally. I mean, this happens over and over, but every kind of shifts in regulation that come from the company or come from the government change change user migration. And for social media, it's maybe a little bit different, but for open source, it creates, like, social media, maybe that the government doesn't care as much about having a nationalized social media. I mean, maybe they do, or certainly China does, but I think for open source, countries really care about innovation and technology, and so it becomes this sort of really big trade-off between regulating and attracting developers. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, we should talk more about. I think you're right. I don't think users are leaving Gitee because of to protest. They're just leaving it because they can't
Yeah, we
handle
have
it.
2 more questions. Probably Rongxin, you want to go again because that is like a follow-up question.
Oh, no, sorry. It's not like a follow-up question. It's just like 3 migration mechanisms that's inspired by Professor Hai. I think it would be helpful to our discussion. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's awesome.
Political values, technique and knowledge,
political values,
commercial motivations. Yes. Yeah, thank you.
yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So, Suni, from US.
Okay, sorry, I'm in the US. So that's why I'm
Awesome.
looking a little bit. Yeah, this is after work. So I am an assistant professor from Department of Communication at North Dakota State University. I have a question regarding the concurrent impact resulting from the organization's reaction to the censorship. So because there are multiple levels. So my argument is like the decrease of the Gitee users after the censorship could possibly be shaped by these internal policies, shaped by these organizations, which have a reaction to this like state level or company level censorship at Gitee. So do you have any kind of plan to analyze like organizational level mechanisms?
Yeah, that's really interesting. No, we don't have a plan to do this, but I think you're absolutely right. Like, why, it would be very interesting to know how this happened organizationally, right? What were the decisions? It seems like there could have been another way to do it, which is to review platforms without making them private and then delete platforms that had VPNs, right? Instead of breaking everyone's code. So why was there that decision to make this such a big thing, right? Was it in part like a punishment for the platform? Or was it something that the platform decided in protest of what the rule was? Or was it just a mistake? It's very difficult to know without having been able to talk to somebody who who would know. But I think it's an incredibly important question because there's so many levels of this hierarchy of regulation, right? And how people make decisions, it's really important. So I think it's a fundamental question. If you have any ideas of how we could go about thinking of that, I'd be all ears. Yeah.
Wenchang, Wenchang, do you want to ask you directly or so anyway, I can read. Thank you for sharing. I have the question about constructing panel data in research on online communities. When we study online communities, the behavioral data we connect from users' activity records is often uneven, with some users showing very high activity levels, such as frequent interactions. Does this affect our observation of the results? Since we are observing the overall platform dynamics, would these highly active users affect the representativeness of the platform? This is quite different from traditional survey data. Do you have any experience to share about constructing this type of data? Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question and something I think about frequently. with constructing these types of data sets. So I think like the question, one of the questions to ask is like, what is the ideal data set, right? And like if you could imagine having an ideal data set, which was a random sample of users. But the problem is like in these types of online data sets, if you actually do a random sample of users, you get a lot of people who just don't, they just made an account and then they never did anything, right? And so that they're actually not who you want to study because they're blank accounts, or they're accounts that posted one thing once and they give you absolutely no, like they don't have, there's no data there. So then the question is like, well, how do you sample users who are like active users maybe? I think for the GitHub example in our paper, this is much more straightforward because GitHub has a very usable API. We can look and see. So what we did is first we sampled, you can't actually sample by, you have to get like people's profile information first in order to sample by locations within the profile information. So the first thing that we did is we said, okay, anybody who has a repository that has any Chinese character in it, we're going to grab their profile data, and then we're going to find data where people's locations are in mainland China. So we have to find some way to like narrow this down, but then we can get everyone on GitHub that's public, right? That because of the API. So we think that that is pretty good at getting, is like a comprehensive panel. On Gitee, though, there's no way to really do that through the API. So you have to do the snowball sample. And so that's going to really be affected by things like what you're saying, by how much people are committing and interacting. They're going to be a lot more likely to come into the snowball sample. And that's just kind of one of the limitations of the data collection, right? And then for cross-platform users, of course, that's even a smaller subset of that, right? So it's like you have to really figure out who are actually, you have to make sure they're the same people, right, on both of the platforms. And that's definitely not a random sample of all users that are probably using both of the platforms either. So I think if I were going to give advice on this, it's like really thinking about what the research question is to define the sample, I think, and then you have to sort of like deal with the realities of the data collection to do your best to get the most comprehensive sample you can get based on what that quantity of interest is that you want to measure. But so it's more complicated than survey data, because in some sense you want to reflect active users more on a platform because they're doing more things, like they make up more of the platform activity. At the same time, you also want to make sure you don't just reflect active users. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? If not, I'm going to ask probably the next question. So
Sounds good.
it's already
Yeah.
very late that in California. Okay, so
Yeah.
back to censorship. Okay, so because you are definitely an expert in censorship, so I like your book very much, and also
Oh, thanks.
yeah, it's a must-read book that for our PhD students.
Thanks.
At least they are school, okay, school communication. So it's very good because you mentioned a lot of very sophisticated strategies, censorship strategies in mainland China. So it reminds me.
Yeah.
So now actually everything has been changing since that we have ChatGPT. So you can imagine that there will be some more sophisticated regulations on AI. So I'm not sure that do you observe some interesting strategies, censorship strategies on AI? Because that for me, it's really hard for me even that to imagine how we can regulate or censor something. What kind of things that we can censor from AI, from ChatGPT or any other like DeepSeek? So do you have observe some? So just the observation.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, AI is not neutral in the sense that like you ask it things, it will tell you what it
Yeah,
thinks, right? I mean,
yeah.
um, and certainly we see a lot of censorship of, you know, there's the reinforcement learning step that is, you know, on DeepSeek or on these on you definitely if you ask it certain questions it doesn't answer or it will tell you something that you know is not true if they're really politically sensitive. So there's one form of censorship, like on chat on DeepSeek, for example, like telling you that refusing to answer a particular question or telling you something that's not true about you know, a sensitive question. And you definitely see that. And you also see things like that on
Sorry, I have to.
ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry.
go for it. Yeah.
Just to interrupt because that is I'm
Yeah.
so interested in that. So you know that a DeepSeek that if you use the official website, that indeed
Yes.
that it refuse to answer some questions.
Yeah.
But it's strange is that actually if you launch the DeepSeek using the source code um
Yeah.
from other platforms that actually can use that DeepSeek from third party service like a POE or
Yes.
whatever. So
Yeah.
actually the answer to the question
Yeah.
is good. Well, very well.
Yeah. Well, DeepSeek is a really powerful model. It answers questions very well generally, but it's still, we did a comparison using the API, not using the interface. It still will answer more favorably about, you know, political institutions in China than other models will. Where that is coming from is a whole other discussion. But also, I mean, certainly ChatGPT will refuse to answer certain questions 100%, right? From this same
Yes.
reinforcement learning step. So who owns the model matters, right? A lot. What the model is trained on matters. We have a paper we're working on this. And then and then and in some sense it's centralizes the provision of information more than social media. Like in social media, you find all these different pieces of information. In AI, it's all centralized. And so does that make it more controlled? That's one thing I'm wondering, right? Or do you get enough models that does it that are competing that you can get whatever version you want? I don't know. It's very interesting in the US because like if you ask it questions about American politics, these models tend to be very liberal.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so where does that come from? Does it come from, you know? So I think there's just a lot of really interesting questions about who it should reflect and like how it's controlled and where politics comes in and lots of interesting questions for the next round of the book. Yeah. I don't know. What do you think? Where do you think
I have
we'll
no idea because I think
yeah.
that you are an expert. You must know some new forms. I don't know. So because it's very hard for me. I can so yeah. So probably that they have multiple there could be multiple models that are competed with each other. So like Elon Musk that are probably I'm not sure that how they develop the models to be different, intentionally to be different from ChatGPT. So maybe they
Yeah.
train on different types of data. It's hard to say that you can.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different data, different models, but also then different like post training essentially, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's very
And
interesting.
different
Yeah.
feedback of users. Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Sorry. Go for it.
Yeah. No. I have no other comments. So that
Yeah.
just very interesting. I hope that you can write another book very soon.
Yeah, there we go. Censored by chatbots.
Censorship.
Or not,
Oh,
maybe. I
yeah.
don't know. Yeah, yeah. Cool. Well,
Okay.
thanks for having me. This is really fun. And thanks for all your guys' awesome questions and comments. I have a lot to think about, so appreciate it.
Okay. So
Yeah.
thank you very much for Professor Roberts' very interesting talk, and also for the audience for joining us and also asking the questions. Okay, so thank you again. So
Great. Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah,
yeah. Hope next
we'll
time
talk
we
soon.
can see you offline in Hong Kong.
Yeah, hopefully at some point.
Yeah,
Yeah, that'd be
okay.
great. All
Okay,
right.
thank
Bye, you
you.
guys.
Thank you all. Okay, bye bye.